So Yen, the hedgehogs are, which side of the picture are they on as you see it?
It's on the right.
Okay, so that's good. So I'm just making sure that what I see on the screen is what you see on the screen. So that means the picture on the left, the building on the left of the picture is the first science and engineering building that was built here at UC Merced. So it's called SE1, Science and Engineering 1. And the building on the right is called Science and Engineering 2, very creative, right? So, and in the background, you see right in the middle, you see a round tank, and that is part of our physical plant. And the tank contains a lot of water that is pumped around the buildings as part of a thermal management system. This campus is very green, very environmentally conscious. And so the way we use energy here is with a lot of environmental consideration. Okay, so Atwater, California, which is just up the road from Merced. And if you haven't looked at a map to see where Merced is, if you cut out the outline of California, so find a map, cut out the outline of California, and figure out where the center of mass is. Okay, so if you stuck a pin through the center of mass and you put the California map cut out, you put a pin through the center of mass and pin it onto a notice board, then it doesn't matter what is the orientation of the map, it will stay where you leave it, because if you're in the center of mass, there's no, there's no sort of side that's heavier than the other. So we're right in the middle of California. Okay. And right now, this week, so you may know here we have Yosemite National Park nearby, and this week there has been a forest fire that has been affecting the park. Maybe it's on your news. I know people in Europe have been seeing this on their news, but it seems that the firefighters have at least been able to protect the very large, very famous giant sequoia trees from that. Okay, so that's where we are. The first question that I was asked, and I received these questions, within the last couple of weeks, and so there's an opportunity to think about possible answers. This first question, I have no technical knowledge of. So full disclosure, I don't have a lot of technical knowledge, but I have an opinion. As long as you realize that what I'm giving you here is probably more based in opinion than in fact, then we can proceed with it. But the question that I was asked was, what is the best innovation to invest in right now? Okay, so what is the best innovation to invest in right now? And my initial response to Yen when she sent this question, I said that investment advice is not something that I am confident about. However, then I started to think, and I think to myself, if I knew the answer to, if I really knew the answer, and if there was an easy answer, would I want to tell anybody the answer? Or would I maybe just want to go and buy as much stock in this idea as possible so that I get to make all the money? Right? You see, so if this is an attempt at humor, right? Because if somebody has a really good tip for investment, would they share it with everybody? There's a moral question for you. So, one could philosophically discuss that. But yes, I'm a teacher, and that means I do like to share things with other people. So if I did have a good investment advice, I would share it with you, right? So you can be confident of that. But personally, I've never been involved directly in making investments. Not directly. My pension, the university invests my pension money in some investment somewhere, but I make no decision in that process. So some ideas, some opinions here. The best innovation might not be the most successful innovation. Best because it sounds creative, because it sounds like something you believe in. And that could be, you invest in something you believe, something you want to support. That's a perfectly good reason. Now, there's a risk associated with that, because maybe the thing you believe in and the thing you want to support doesn't pay out eventually. But the thing is that success doesn't always depend on whether the idea is good. It also depends on how the idea is implemented, right? So you take the idea, how is the idea put into practice? How is it brought to the market? How is it advertised? Will people want the product? So you can have a fantastic idea and maybe even manage to tell people about the fantastic idea. But if for some reason not enough people think it's fantastic, or the economy is bad, or something political happens, people get distracted from your idea because something else is in the news. Well, you know, so best and successful, they are not necessarily the same thing. So you can give some thought to that. Personally, I think if I was going to invest, I would have to take the time to learn about the people and the reputation and whether I trust them, the people behind the idea that I'm trying to invest in. I think that would be important. So, you know, are the people ethical? Can I trust them with my money? But also, do they have the connections? Do they have what it takes to make the idea, not just take from a good idea, but can they make the good idea into some sort of success? So there's, you know, how I would probably go about it. I would also ask myself about whether the idea is one that people need. Is it a useful idea that people in the long run, does it meet a need? Or is it just something that people might briefly want? And whether one needs something or whether one wants something, that can be two very different things. Okay, and again, a little bit of sort of philosophical, there's going to be some opinion, because finding agreement on, you know, what I want, you may or may not want. What you need, I may or may not need. But I think there's a longer future, because something that you need is a solution to something. There's a problem, and you know, a need is something which is there's a problem, there's something missing, and there's something that the idea that one might invest in, the creativity, is to find a solution to that problem. As opposed to what do people want? Well, that's just a fashion. So it can be very quick, and you know, people want it for, you know, 6 months or 6 weeks or 6 days, and then they don't want it, and you're stuck with a huge infant. You know, whoever invented this idea may be stuck with a lot of product they can't even get rid of because the fashion has moved on. So no, I would never buy, personally, if I was buying or investing in something, I would never invest in fashion. And I tread very carefully here because, you know, I know that Yen's sister is involved in fashion. So I would totally buy her product because I think she makes a great product, and her product in a sense is somewhat timeless. You know, making tie-dye, people will always like tie-dye. It's established. So somebody who's good at tie-dye, I would buy that product. But I wouldn't invest in a company that is trying to guess what the fashion will be. And I hope you can see the distinction between those two. So one is fashion changes quickly. You know, so I'll be completely silly here. You know, somebody invents a shirt with 3 sleeves. Yeah, you know, it could look cool to have an extra sleeve. You know, I mean, you could keep some you could keep something in the extra sleeve, perhaps. You know, or it would look kind of cool, or people might be amused there's an extra sleeve sort of flapping around on this, and it could be a fashion briefly. But I probably wouldn't, you know, want to invest in something that was just kind of not meeting any need, and not being long lasting. But I would absolutely invest in a company that makes shirts, because everybody needs shirts. So I think you have to make the distinction between, is it a long lasting need or is it a short-term fashion? I would be very interested in Jean's opinion on what I've just said here. So again, please realize what I'm giving is an opinion here, right? So if she agrees, I'd like to hear that, and if she disagrees, I will welcome the disagreement. You know, so okay. But it's an element of risk. You know, what people need, if there's a real solution to a real problem, there's less risk than if it's just something that, it's a cool idea, but, you know, does it actually meet a need, or is it just a fashion? So on what other factors does the success of the innovation depend? You know, if it depends on the supply of a particular material, does it involve a particular talent being supplied, or a particular material, or a particular set of laws being available to make this thing or do it? Does it involve trade at a scale, or transportation at a scale which may or may not be available? Those are questions I think that one would have to ask as well. So how realistically can the idea be implemented to ensure that it's successful? I should also say my comments about fashion. My mom was a textile engineer, actually. So my mom, we think she was the first woman in the West to get a textile engineering degree. And what do textile engineers do? Well, they build the machines that you create fashions on. But her idea, and maybe this is sort of helped, I think, people always need clothes. But be prepared for people not to need fancy clothes. Make the fabrics that people need that help them to do their job. Sorry, so I've just went backwards a little bit there in terms of furthering my thoughts here. Question I would have is, when you're investing in an innovation and recognizing an innovation, is it best to be first? Because sometimes one might be drawn to invest in the first people to do something. And I would, largely opinion here, but I would say that there are some indications that you don't want to invest in the first person to do something, because the first person to do something is probably going to make quite a lot of mistakes. And it's maybe the second person who comes along, or the second company, that actually can capitalize on the mistakes made by the first company. And in my own, this sort of feeds into one of the other questions that comes later, but in my own research, I'm interested in silk, and specifically the structure of silk, spider silk as well as silkworm silk. Of course, Thailand is famous for silkworm silk, probably not for making things out of spider silk, but for making good things out of silkworm silk. But I'm interested in learning about silks in general and lessons from nature in general. Now, there are many companies who are trying, a lot of startup companies around the world who have at various times tried to take the genetic information from a silkworm and either alter it so the silkworms make a different kind of silk, or put it into something that isn't a worm so it can continuously make the silk, so you can put that genetic information into bacteria, or into goats, so they secrete the silk in their milk. This has been tried. And there are people who are taking spider genes and putting them into silkworms. So the silkworm can, because spiders are very difficult to farm, difficult to make a spider farm, right? Why? Because spiders, they don't like living together in the same space like silkworms. They kind of kill each other. And people are too afraid to work in a spider farm, so you can't really get people who want to work there. So taking the spider genetic information, putting it into the silkworm, there's some value in getting better silks out of silkworms there. But I'm currently writing, just in my part of my own work, I'm writing a review article on the really biomedical side of silk use. And one of the questions I've been trying to address is look at all the different companies that have come and gone. And the most successful companies probably are not the first company, because the first company had to iron out some of the difficulties. And then other people say, hey, we can do that. In the meantime, some of the knowledge has come along. So first isn't necessarily the one that you want to pick. Okay. Some examples from engineering and materials engineering. There's an airplane called and I'm going to put this in the chat. And we might, did I spell this correctly? Yes, there we go. So Yen, do you recognize this? We may have, I can't remember if we talked about this during your time here. But...
I know only the comment, but I don't know the name of it.
Okay, so this airplane is famous. It was the first passenger jet aircraft. It was made by a company called de Havilland. De Havilland is the company. Comet is the name of the airplane. And it was built in the 1950s. So first jet airplane, before Boeing was building jet airplanes. Okay, Boeing existed as a company, but they were not building jet passenger airplanes yet. McDonnell Douglas were not building passenger. So de Havilland got there first. And their planes crashed. There were some accidents, some really bad accidents. And so they had to ground the planes while people figured out what was going wrong. And Boeing was able to learn from the mistakes that had emerged from the de Havilland aircraft. And so Boeing became the big famous passenger jet company that is part of what it does now. It also has military operations, but it became a world leader in but starting out at approximately the same time as de Havilland. But de Havilland got in the air first, and they did make some mistakes. So, and I don't know, is Kitty Pong an engineer, or what can you tell me?
Yes,
Engineer?
he is.
Okay,
Yes.
so this is good to know. The original Comet aircraft had square windows. Now, and that's because airplanes before that used to have square windows. It's really easy to make a square hole in something. I'm going to put a square piece of glass in there and bolt it on. But if you've had any mechanical or materials engineering, you will have learned about stress concentrations. And the thing about the Comet, of course, being a passenger aircraft, it had to be pressurized. And so what happens, it goes through pressure cycles. So there's a fatigue element of stresses growing and shrinking and growing and shrinking. But there's also a stress concentration element. And so those square windows were a critical design flaw. And that's a simple explanation. There were other explanations about why it didn't work, but basically the fracture mechanics of what it took to design a safe airplane hadn't been fully worked out at the time that this airplane was first built. And so de Havilland doesn't exist anymore as a company. It became part of what became British Aerospace. You can tell from my accent that I'm from the UK originally. And so, of course, you see, I can imagine, you know, Britain, England, having an aircraft industry that could have been world leading. But they got there a little bit too soon without working out all the details, you see. And so being first is fantastic. That was a great plane, but it's not the one that actually survived in terms of, you know, how designs worked. Another example. If you were going to invest in a pharmaceutical company, and these days probably investing in companies that can very rapidly respond to a virus and produce a vaccine or a drug to counteract the virus, that's probably some, you know, you probably want to think about possibly companies like that, right? You could make a good case for it. But historically, there is a drug which you may have heard of. Let me putting it in the chat here. I hope I spelt it correctly. Again, just checking. But this drug, this was you know, several decades ago, and it was developed and had a lot of publicity. It was very successful at preventing morning sickness in pregnant women. So it was an antidote, and it had some other uses as well, antidote to morning sickness. And this was great because, you know, morning sickness is not a great thing, and so it looked like a really good idea and very promising, and it worked. What subsequently emerged, and it's a very sad story, is that it created terrible birth defects in a number of the children who were born from mothers who took the thalidomide. And there were lawsuits and, you know, all sorts of problems. Now these days, it is actually finding use. The same drug is finding use as in cancer treatment, but not in pregnant women for obvious reasons because of its you know, terrible side effects. But again, you know, so maybe this was done in a time when all the tests that we now have for accepting drugs. A lot of, you know, all the tests and all the experiments that you have to subject, all the trials you have to subject drugs to now. So you're getting a license for the vaccines for COVID takes a long time, because people are much more strict now about what has to be tested before you can actually bring something like this to market. But it's a great example, and a very sad example, of they had a product. It was great for what it did, but again, it was maybe, you know, they hadn't followed through on all the details and the consequences. The Sinclair calculator. Let me put Sinclair into. Okay, and of course, I realize this might be on YouTube. I have to be careful what I say about companies, right? Because so the Sinclair calculator, which came out in the 1970s, I think it was. And before I'm talking about them today, I actually went online. I was preparing a little bit for today's discussion. So I just checked if my memory was correct, and I downloaded an instruction manual for one. You can find all sorts of things online these days. I actually found the instruction manual for one of these calculators. It's one of the early pocket calculators, not the first. HP got there first. Texas Instruments got there pretty much at the same time. Then Sinclair came along. What they did, they produced the first cheap, easily affordable pocket calculator. But I got there, I found their instruction manual online. And the instruction manual admits to the problem that I'm about to describe, so I'm safe talking about it, right? So the thing about the Sinclair pocket calculator, it was inexpensive, but you couldn't necessarily trust it to give you the right answer. Now, for a pocket calculator, this is kind of a problem, right? And what it tells you in the instruction manual is that when the batteries start to become depleted, and so if you see the display starts to get dim, change the batteries as soon as the display starts to get dim. Now, whether, you know, how soon any one individual notices that, of course, is not very necessarily reproducible. But when the batteries go down, it does not give you, you can do the same calculation and get two different answers. So let us put it this way: that company does not currently exist making calculators. You know, HP survived, Texas Instruments survived, Casio, you know, they make great calculators. But the first attempt at a cheap calculator didn't work terribly well, and so that was probably not. So, you know, people could invest. Yes, they could invest in the company when it's there, but they have to be careful, because they have to stay on top of it. And if as soon as a problem arises, they probably don't want to stay invested for, you know. So if you make investment, what sounds like a good idea on Monday, just keep checking that on Friday is still a good idea. You know. So to this day, when I use a pocket calculator, even though I use pocket calculators which are, I personally, I never owned a Sinclair calculator, but a lot of students did during my, when I was a student. And when I was a TA, during my first years of TAing, a lot of students had Sinclair calculators. And so if the answer didn't make sense, you know, my first response, of course, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have phones you can do calculations on, these didn't exist yet, right? But if somebody gets a weird answer when I'm a TA, the first thing I say, okay, let me see your calculator. Okay, well, you know, yeah, borrow mine, or, you know, check with your neighbor, use their calculator. And to this day, if I do something on a pocket calculator, and yes, I'm an old person, so I don't use it, you know, I do not reach for my phone as a calculator. I reach for my calculator. Okay, I always run it through the calculator twice. Just because, you know, at an important stage in my life, I was seeing too much of, even though the calculators are reliable, but you see, there's another source of error, which is me. Maybe I'm not hitting the right buttons. So I run it twice anyway, and if I don't get the same answer, I run it a third time until I get a consistent answer. Okay, so that's sort of a little bit of an aside relative to what I, you know, started talking about. But there we go. And there could be many, you know, these are not the only examples, but I think I've given you a few here. So the very last point I would make is, if I absolutely, you know, what what does the world need? Not what is fashionable, but what does the world desperately need? Okay, those are coming back to that idea. And one thing we need is reliable energy storage. Energy, sources of reliable energy and ways to store that energy. And storage is particularly important because many of the most environmentally friendly sources of energy, which are solar, plenty of solar, but it's from day to day. Some days you have clouds, some days you do not. So the output from solar is variable. And the same with wind and the same with waves. So you need something to store that energy. And this is going to be more and more important. And so finding reliable, safe storage, affordable storage. And there's several reasons why people are wanting to move away from lithium ion. Lithium's great, it's lightweight, and it's high energy density, but there are also safety issues concerned with lithium ion. And there's some questions about where do you get the lithium from and how is it extracted and how much energy do you need to get it out of where you find it and which countries have the source of it. And so moving away from lithium, I read interestingly recently that there are some companies in China which are making sodium ion, which can also have its safety issues because sodium is reactive just like lithium is, but at least it's easy to find. If you want to find sodium, you just go down to the beach and dip a bucket into the ocean and you can find sodium. It's very easy, right? So I would say that the need is somehow it becomes a political issue. There are some people who claim that we don't have global warming. Some people say there's no global warming and there's no big problem with the environment. Well, I disagree on scientific grounds. Now, this is not opinion, this is fact. We have a problem with regards to the environment and global warming. And so the need is there for energy management and energy storage. So I would say that's but I perhaps wouldn't invest in the first company who makes a sodium ion battery, but I might invest in the second,
Sodium from like sodium chloride, but this one is soluble. But if we dry it, it will be like crystal. Now I'm in my head is like, how can we remove the chloride ion? But I'm thinking if it in the water, then we could like separate the ions.
The process is not simple, but of course you can get metallic sodium. Because you might remember from, well, at least when I was in high school in chemistry, my teachers used to actually, we had sodium that the teacher would throw it into water and actually overdid it once, actually. It was kind of interesting, but there are ways to extract sodium metal. And probably for the audience and for this video, I'm not going to go into a lot of sort of detailed chemistry here, but the mechanisms exist, and the source is more readily accessible, and it's less geographically sensitive as to who has access to it. So, okay, so but yes, it's something I think we in engineering courses, learning more about the extraction of raw materials is something we should probably focus more on, because every material comes with an environmental cost. And so in the long run, if we can invest in the ability to be less environmentally impactful, that's not a fashion, that's a need. Right? If we go back to what I was commenting on earlier. It's not fashionable to be environmental. Some people think it's fashionable and it's going to go away again, but this is urgent and much more important than a mere fashion. It's a serious need. A student is interested to know whether there is a specific term for the relationship of object to feeling. And this apparently, we think, came out of probably came from a student in Yen's Beauty of Life class, is sentimental value. So the context, which I actually asked for some input, is so, and I'll just read here from the dialogue that Yen and I had a couple of weeks ago. Some students, from your course now, some students selected to express their feeling about the souvenir they received, basketball hoop built with dad, or dog collar of the dog that they took care of, but the dog no longer is alive, a doll that they're taking care of, a bike that they rode, so some object, and it is associated with some feeling. And is there a term for that? I think the term that I would use is sentimental value. I'll put that in the chat. Sentimental value. Can I type? No, try that. Okay, so there's perhaps no intrinsic value. You know, it could be an old rusty bike, or an old sort of cracked and discolored dog collar, or whatever it is. But to one individual person, or to some small group of people, it means the world. It has no monetary value, because, you know, why would I want that collar, or why would I want that bike? You know, I'd spend my money on something else, right? Not one of these objects. But to the person who has the memories and the emotional attachment to, I would say that the word is sentimental value, and you can't put a price on that. Okay. So this then got me thinking, of course. So that was a short answer. The term you're perhaps looking for is sentimental value. But then that also, you know, let's not lose sight of it in terms of what we talked about in the previous question. Does somebody want it, or does somebody need it? You know, do they need that rusty old bike, or do they need that dog collar? No, the sun will come up in the morning and the world will continue if that object doesn't exist. But they want it, and they want it for a good reason. So it sort of perhaps it fits into a little bit of that distinction between need and want as well. It can help us to maybe think about what we mean when we say need versus want. But there's some more thoughts about this, and when I taught what was an introductory materials course here at UC Merced, amazingly called Introduction to Materials, and I think Yen TA'd for that course, at least on one occasion, on one semester. But I don't know whether, because that lecture, I don't give it every time that I taught the course, because it's right at the end, and sometimes there are not enough days in the semester, because course is taught perhaps on a Wednesday, but some Wednesdays are holidays, you know, and so that maybe not enough Wednesdays in the semester to get to that last lecture. But I talk a little bit in it when I can about the sort of the value and the psychology of materials. Why do people want things? Why do people buy things? Okay, and this is because, and it's got nothing to do with it's not material science in the engineering sense of the word, because it's not about measuring strength and toughness and electrical conductivity. These are all the properties, yes, you need to make the object work, but just because something conducts electricity really well and is really, really strong, maybe there are other products which are similar. Well, which one does a customer want to buy? So now you have to find ways to make the customer want it. And this is where this sort of, you start having a crossover between the engineering and the psychology. And marketing people and advertising people, right? You know, in a company. And being able to see across those disciplinary boundaries can be useful. So when I can, I try to include a lecture just sort of at the very beginning of some of those ideas. And so one can talk about, and this term does exist, product personality. Product personality. And a product sort of has to, in a sense, have attributes of personality to form the attachment so that you think you want it. Right? This is, okay. It's also called product appeal. Does it appeal to people? Right? So product personality, product appeal. And so in that sense, one does have to think about associations. So technically, what do you associate with the product? What does the maker, the manufacturer, the advertiser, what do they expect you to associate with it to make you want it? Okay. Whether or not you need it. You know, and maybe it is something that you need, but there's a choice of products. Well, so you need one of these things, but which one do you now want? That makes it, that really closes the sale. So that's the one that you buy. Okay, so, you know, so associations, and I've got some car examples here. Now, I don't know how well known these cars are in Thailand. I think they're quite famous brands of cars, but the association, you know, so a Rolls-Royce associates with wealth. You know, so they will put things into a Rolls-Royce that, if you like, ordinary people can't afford, but somebody who can afford it, because maybe they don't feel special enough already, they've got to feel even more special. So, you know, the marketers will try to make them feel even more special, even though they don't need that extra feature. But yeah, you know, they probably want it because it helps them to feel more secure in their own specialness. Some people like the association with animals. Do you know what a VW Beetle is? I'll put it in the chat. So if I say the VW Beetle, Volkswagen Beetle, it's kind of, it's a cute car, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, people did not buy that car because it's particularly fast. It's very reliable, and actually had an air-cooled. The original model had an air-cooled engine, which is great because you can't run out of, you know, you can't boil the water over in the coolant or whatever. But it's sort of, it's just kind of cute, you know. It looks like a bug, you know. so that people are sort of drawn to that. Or what do I have here? If you've looked at a lot of the cars in the United States, a lot of American cars in the 1950s had enormous tail fins on them. Okay, I'll put that phrase. So there you go.
I saw it at the Stanilos. Is it county fair? But it's not a county fair, but they close the road and then they have this car there. Yeah.
Yes, they have sort of car shows, and some of the cars have funny springs and they sort of ride on the side. You have some of those as well.
I did not see that one,
Okay,
but I saw the one with the tail.
Okay, but those tail fins are completely useless. They don't do anything. But why were they there? Because people think it looks faster. It makes it look like a faster car because it looks a bit more like an airplane, looks a little bit more like aerospace. You see, so there's the association with aerospace. It must be a high performance fast car, so people want it. The idea at the time. Or do you know what a mini car is? The Mini?
Yes, Mini Cooper.
Yes. Yeah. So why do people want a Mini? Because it reminds them of their toys. They want it. It's a toy. It's kind of, you know, so there's an association again that some people tap into, you know, in that way. Or what about the Land Rover? Because, you know, some people are impressed by military things, you know, and toughness and military, sort of tough guy sort of thing. So the association, right? So. And I think this all still fits into that, the relationship between people and the object, and it really is actually ultimately very important in marketing. There's also perception. So association is, most people would agree on association. You know, so if you look at a Volkswagen Bug, Volkswagen Beetle, you don't think that looks like a plane. You know, if you look at a car with tail fins, you don't think that looks like a bug. So people pretty much agree on association. What they will disagree on more is on perception. How does it make you feel? But again, the way that things are marketed, they will be a particular customer base and they're reaching out and they're trying to touch you in this particular way. Examples, you know, so does it make you feel playful or does it make you feel responsible? Some people like a product, it makes them feel young again, versus this is a really reliable product, you know, so you know, serious versus not serious. Okay, is it a guy thing? Is it a girl thing? Does it make guys feel more masculine? Does it make girls feel more girly? Marketed in different ways. So perception. Does it make you feel adventurous, or does it make you feel protected and sheltered? Some people want to go out for the adventure. Some people rather stay home in the comfort zone. Different perceptions. But what makes, what I think is adventurous, somebody who's really adventurous might think is really sort of just comfortable and ordinary. So it's a personal thing, right? So, so I hope that gives some perspectives on the relationship between the object and the thing. When I talk about intrinsic, when I talk about sentimental value, okay, this is what the object means to you or to me or whoever's having the conversation about the object. Anthropomorphic, and potentially another word in this sort of broad conversation, when you give an animal or a plant or an object, you give it the characteristics of a human. So when you say, oh, that car speaks to me in a loud voice and tells me that it is, somebody might say that, right? Well, they're basically giving the car the characteristics of a person. So this is attributing human characteristics to an object. So if the relationship between the object extends to the point where you associate human characteristics with it, and to essentially saying that when you say this color is too loud, or the forest whispered to me in a soothing voice. Forests don't whisper; they don't have voices, really. But you're giving them a personal sort of characteristic, and through that you may also be developing a sentimental attachment to the object. So I thought that word, just to round out this conversation on that topic, I should introduce you to that word if you didn't know it already.
Yeah, I have not seen this word before.
And Pin's first question is, what is the innovation that you are studying and or interested? So I'm interested in everything, actually. This is part of the problem. So I admit it. One of my many flaws is that I am not always very focused, because everything interests me. So seriously, the world is too interesting and life is too short. That is one of the biggest kind of stresses in life, is there's not enough time to do all the interesting and learn all the interesting things that are possible. So when I try to focus, I try to learn lessons from nature. So nature makes some very interesting materials and machines. And so I try to learn those lessons that nature can teach me about how to make. And so over the years, I've learned from silk. I'm still learning from silk, and how it is able to be strong and stiff and tough, and a good material for biomedical uses. And so you can grow cells on it. It's a good. And oh, I should have asked, what is Pin's? What's her background?
She studies psychology.
Psychology.
She is going to be in her third year.
Okay, so I'm probably using some words here that are, but I think everybody has a sense of what strength means in the material. And so basically silk is a very interesting, very durable, very versatile and interesting material. And I'm trying to learn, how it manages that. Mucus, right? Mucus. So actually, now here, a little English lesson here in case it's necessary. Mucus, spelt this way, versus, I'm going to spell it two different ways. And I would say that a lot of native English speakers get this wrong, including a lot of journalists who've written about my research over the years. So the difference between those two words, as I put in the chat. Mucus, M-U-C-U-S, and mucus, M-U-C-O-U-S. Okay, well, mucus, the one without the O, that is the noun, the stuff. And mucus with the O in it is the adjective that describes stuff that is like that. Okay, and very often people give me the adjective when they mean the noun. Native English speakers. So this is why I'm being so unkind as to suggest that you might need me to point out the spelling difference, because like I say, you know, native English speakers really kind of don't get this one right as often as they should. And so mucus is fantastic. It's a fantastic lubricant, and it's very important in our own bodies and different in the lungs, in the stomach, in the reproductive tract, how it lubricates. And so learning lessons about a water-based environmentally friendly lubricant, kind of interesting stuff. So at one point I was quite interested in it's called sweat. It isn't really sweat, but it's a skin secretion, the pink sort of skin secretion from hippopotamuses. And how is that able to work as a sunscreen and a sunblock and a sort of skin kind of lubricant as well? So some examples of lessons from nature. And I'm still interested in those, and particularly silks. Still do some research, and I'm writing on that. But the thing that I'm perhaps most active in now, in terms of just research that I have a student also who's engaged in this research, is trying to find simple models for the spread of COVID and diseases in general. Now, what has this got to do with materials science, you might ask, if you've realized that I am a materials science engineering sort. Now, what on earth has this got to do with the spread of diseases? And the answer is that some of the mathematical approaches to how processes happen in materials, and those processes might involve, let's say, how you take something that is molten, a melt, and you crystallize it. And there are similarities. So imagine you've got a bunch of stuff in which crystals are going to grow and take over that liquid and turn it into a solid. Well, the way in which you take a population of people and you start nucleating a disease, and it spreads and takes over some of that population. Surprisingly, the mathematical analysis of those processes is actually fairly similar. And so I'm very interested in cross-disciplinary research. This is why, you know, the earlier part where I say lessons from nature. So I have to go and learn some biology and, you know, learn about plants and learn about animals, although my degree involves physics and chemistry and math. But I'm also discovering that, you know, in material science, which involves the physics and the chemistry and the math, can now also be applied, some of the ideas and some of the approaches to find ways to model and explain. And you know, people don't understand viruses, but they understand why ice forms in the freezer. And so you can have the same conversation about how does ice form in liquid water in a freezer. You could have the same, you can have a conversation in a similar way about how does a healthy population get infected and get taken over. How does the disease spread? There are surprising similarities, and by exploring the similarities, you can gain insights into the process to which you are newly applying that sort of analogy. So that's, in a nutshell, is what I'm interested in. And I have an absolutely wonderful graduate student right now who is working on the project that I just described. Her name is Kiana Shehzad at UC Merced. And yes, I'm having a lot of fun on the project because you know, we're learning interesting things. So that is a quick look, and of course I can talk about things I'm interested in and what am I studying and what would I like to study. I mean, I could keep talking for a very long time, which would not be kind to you. So I'm not going to do that. The second question from Pin: what are the learning strategies to understand and practice the process of innovation? Well, now you see, I think Yen can answer that question because she and I taught. One of the highlights of my career, I really enjoyed doing this. I just really did. And it was nice not to have to do this on my own. It was nice to do it together with somebody who is, well, first of all, creative, but secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, a really good teacher. And so, you know, I was able to run ideas past Yen, and she's, you know, if I've got a good idea, she'll encourage me. If I don't have a good idea, she's got amazingly, she's sometimes too polite about it, but she will find a polite way to tell me why I should be thinking about something else, or why I'm mistaken, or whatever, you know. And by the way, polite disagreement is a great way for making creative progress. I would put that down as so what is a strategy? Is it a learning strategy? Well, I don't know if it's a learning strategy, but it is a practical strategy for innovation. You can't do it on your own. You know, you really can't. It involves interaction. Okay, and if I would say if somebody went and sat in a cave by themselves as a hermit, they're probably not going to invent very much. Why won't they invent very much? Because they're not amongst people learning about the need that somebody has. Innovation is often driven by need. Doesn't have to be, but it's if you see the need, the innovation follows. It's much quicker than imagining a need. Okay, so I would say that the strategy is to work, exchange ideas. Don't be afraid to be wrong. Absolutely don't be afraid to be wrong, because sometimes you will be right. Will you always be right? Absolutely not. Will you always be wrong? No. I can't remember, this quote is probably misattributed, but it might have been, oh gosh, Edison. Okay, Thomas Edison. These days it's really hard. One has to go back and fact check, because you go on social media and you see all these posters of people's faces and the quotes that's been attributed to them, and a lot of these things are wrong. But I think it was Edison who said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So, you know, thinking by yourself, no, get out there, talk to people, see what the need is, read, absolutely read as well. Read about creative people. Okay, and I'm sort of going off really quickly here, but when Yen and I co-taught this course, and so it was called The Creative Process. And so I think that Yen knows as much as I do about, you know, because we worked on this course together. We sweated over this perspiration. We perspired over this course together. We had a little bit of inspiration. We had a lot of perspiration. And Yen, being Yen, took really good notes. And you know, I tend to not be quite as good about keeping notes and retrospectively writing down what the reflective part of this. Actually, Yen is much better than me on that. And you can actually learn from the reflective process, because you should go back, you should go over your thoughts. How did I get to this idea? Why did I drop this idea? What came along that was better? What hadn't I figured out? You know, let's keep those kind of notes as well. But in that course, you see, we looked at creative people. Some of them have been dead for a long time. Some of them are very much alive. Some of them were very kind and contributed ideas. You know, we wrote to them and we got some thoughts back from them. I'm thinking particularly of a very, very fine young organist in Germany who sent us some ideas on her creative process, and realized that interdisciplinary is good. So I kind of mentioned that idea. It's worked well for me, you know, and so yeah, I think it's a good idea. Therefore, since it worked, and I'm going to be biased in that respect. But you know, looking at nature for inspiration in materials, or now using what I know in materials to go and maybe help understand a little bit what's going on in nature, you know, which is like the ability to cross disciplines is important. So learn from a good artist. Learn from a good artist, learn from a good poet, learn from a good medical doctor, learn from a good scientist, learn from somebody who contributed to the government in a country. You know? And you know, you have You have very good examples in leadership in Thailand. You can learn creative ideas from. So I totally recommend reading, talking, arguing and discussing respectfully. Ask questions. Ask questions whenever you can. And then there was a book in the course, and 3 creative parts of process. So there was blending, which is where you take 2 ideas and you merge them. And I think interdisciplinary is a great example of blending ideas. You can bend ideas, which is where you take an idea and you make some slight offshoot from it. Or you can take an idea and say, okay, well, it's a good starting point, but I'm going to completely break up this idea into lots of little pieces and put them together in a different way. So blending, bending, and breaking. I can't remember if the book addressed them in those order, but it doesn't matter. The order does not matter at all. It can give us some ways of actually doing things creatively. And practice, do it. Just do creative things. Now, in this course that Yen and I taught, we had a project for the students where we asked them, based on what they're reading in the news or what they perceive on our campus, we asked them to come up with what they perceive to be a need, convince themselves, convince their team, convince me, convince Yen that there is this need, and then start working towards a solution. And the process of working towards a solution isn't, there's not one solution, but argue amongst yourselves, come up with a better solution. And it was really interesting to see how this happened. I was very happy with how it all turned out, because some examples of the success of this process, and I'm saying that because you see, Yen is an expert in this subject, so you can talk about this. Some examples of the success. So some groups looked at what they perceived to be a need on campus. Maybe it was a need to help people understand about the existence of a particular resource, or a communication need on campus. So what they did, and we asked them as part of their project to create a visual depiction of their solution. And we actually had the first time we taught this course, and this was before COVID got in the way, and we later on we had to go online in subsequent offerings of this class. But the first time we taught it, there wasn't COVID, and so we had an art show with our classes, and our classes were students in all sorts of different disciplines. There were people who were computer scientists and mechanical engineers and historians and philosophers and psychologists and all these different groups of people. And they came up with solutions that we used in an art show. We actually had some gallery space on campus. We put up these visual solutions. We had a reception. People came along, and we gave them donuts and coffee. Something called pan, which is PAN, which is a Mexican bread sort of delicacy, right? And 2 of our campus offices, 2 different offices, were so impressed with these solutions and the visual way of displaying it, they took them and hung them up in their own departments. They actually put them on permanent display in their departments. So the need was the need, let me get this right, the need was identified, the solution was produced, and the solution was so good that in a sense, the people who were identified as having a need, they didn't even realize it until they came to our gallery show, but they adopted our solution. It was kind of, and by our, I mean the students, the teams of students, So that was kind of cool. We had a student, so one of our students identified a need, and this was during the pandemic. She identified a need that she wanted to go to medical school. Okay, so she wanted to go to medical school. And what she noticed was that, of course, during COVID, it's difficult for a prospective medical student to shadow a medical practitioner. Now, shadowing, I don't know if that is how that practice works out in other countries, but here, if you want to go here in the States, if you want to go to medical school, before you can even fill in the application, say, I want to go to medical school, you've got to demonstrate that you have some knowledge, some number of hours, hundreds of hours, perhaps even a couple of thousand of hours of experience in some way in a medical field. And so that might mean that you volunteer in a hospital, or it might mean that you have some sort of a job taking notes for a doctor, or it might mean that you spend some number of days just following a doctor around, or a nurse. It doesn't have to be a doctor, it could be a nurse, or it could be a dentist, or somebody in the sort of medical field. And you see what they do, and you learn from this process. That's called shadowing. That last process is called shadowing. You are the shadow. You follow that person like a shadow does, right? And of course, during COVID, that became difficult for two reasons. One is because you're trying to keep distance, and the doctors are overwhelmed. They don't really have time to be shadowed quite in the same way. So what this student in this class that I'm describing at UC Merced, she developed an online platform for shadowing. Identified the need, proposed a solution. But this wasn't part of her, this wasn't part of her team's problem and solution in the class. The amazing thing is, she took this idea with her, and the following year I get an email from her saying, you might be interested in what I've done with what we learned, what I learned in this class. So she started a website. It's now running as a non-profit. People can invest in it, actually, going all the way back to the first question, which I was asked today, right? And sort of closing, to see how ideas are linked. It's really important to link ideas, I think. Okay, so this, and they have tens of thousands of students who've registered and gone through this program now. And they're doctors who are willing to be shadowed online, and nurses and other practitioners are willing. And there are schools, medical schools, that are willing to accept this as an example of shadowing that they will actually allow as being acceptable in applications. So I think, again, it's an example of something that seems to have been fairly successful, right? in the sense of, so probably, we taught our students something useful because, and not everybody who's doing something useful is going to kind of come back and talk about it. But in this particular case, the student was kind enough to get back and say, here's what I've done. And that was, heartwarming,
Yes.